Hello, forums. Recently got the question on how to record audio in the browser. This is something where I thought it would probably be easier to make a video showing what to do than actually type out all the steps. It'll take too long. So if we look at the original post, the user says they've been trying to record audio snippets and play it back. There is a project that already does this. So it's this using Web Audio Recorder JS, which can be downloaded. And they are giving a project, but the project doesn't work. With the idea saying that, hype structure is a little bit different and probably not too clear how to integrate it. So I wanted to go through and get the example working in the hype context and show how to debug and work through something that's kind of non-hype native and bring it into the hype world. And one thing I'll say is that the project that's been created already has a bit of logical consistency and thought into it, but it's missing some key details on both just general JavaScript knowledge and scoping, HTML knowledge, how it integrates with hype. So there's just a few details where all the structure makes logical sense, but doesn't actually work with all the little details of the different technologies. So I wanted to show kind of debugging and also go through some of the problems that this had and get it into a working state. So here's the basic project, and the idea is that you hit record, and it'll make recordings. You can choose what format you want. So I have this one actually running, and so here you can say what format you can record. So I can say this is a test, makes recording, this is a test, and plays it back. So the end result is to have something like this, but in a hype document. So the very first thing that I just want to do is go through some of the structure of the working example before we get into the hype world, and that'll help inform us how we do it. So there is an index.html page, so we can take a look at that because that's going to be what loads first. So if we look at this, we can see it's pretty basic. Here when I bring up the actual, so we can see it has the select item right here, MP3, OGG4 bis, record button, stop button. And so really it's just a very basic HTML structure that just calls out to two different JavaScript files. One is the web audio recorder.min.js, and the other is the app.js, which represents the actual logic for this page, whereas the web audio recorder just provides the audio recording functionality, as the name implies. So let's take a look at app.js, because this is where the bulk of kind of what the page does is going to be. So I'll bring that in here. And we can see at the top, it declares some global variables, adds events to start and stop the recording. The recording does a bunch of this. The nice thing is it has built-in logging, so we can kind of see how far we get. And then there's a few functions like creating the download link and this log, which will actually log to the page versus the console log. So that's the basic structure. And so now let's dive into the hype document. And so the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to preview this and see what happens. And we can actually see we do get a little recording light. That's pretty good. But not too much beyond that is happening. We're getting no logs, we're getting no stop, anything like that. So I'm just going to close that. Why don't we actually see what's going on? So whenever something's not working, the very first thing that I ever do is I look at the console log, because generally there might be some error, and logging can be emitted from that. Even if it's not the code's logging, it could be exception logging. So I do that by hitting Command-Option-J in Chrome. I use Safari a lot too, but Chrome's pretty good. And we can see instantly there's a lot of errors that were created. So we can see uncaught type error, failed to execute post message on window, no function was found, import scripts is not defined. So there's all kinds of these failures. This one's in the web audio recorder wave. This is the MP3. This is the OGG. And the very first thing that stands out to me is, well, in the original script, these weren't defined. If we look in the Finder, yeah, those files are there, but they're not actually defined in the index or the app.js. And so that's kind of a red flag that maybe these files are being loaded in an incorrect order. especially these, which is like reference errors, where it's expecting something to be defined, but it's not defined yet. And so if we look at the hype document, the first thing we see is, okay, all the JavaScript files are in here. And one interesting thing about JavaScript in hype is that when you drag JavaScript in, the default is to automatically include in the head. And if we compare to the index file, first of all, these aren't in the head, which is kind of interesting. Luckily, that won't really come into play later, but that's an interesting detail to note. And it really only defines this web audio recorder. An app would be superseded by the hype stuff, so we don't need that. So there's a lot of files that are already included in the head. We can actually see this by looking in the inspector, and we can see hype's kind of put all these files in there. And so one thing to try is, well, we know we really only want this web audio recorder, so why don't we try selecting these and not including it in the head, and see what happens right there, because that'll automatically cause some errors. So now I'll open up the console again. And yeah, this is actually great. So we have far fewer errors. There's this one warning that we see about web audio autoplay policy will be re-enabled. That's interesting, but totally unrelated, so we can just ignore that. But then there is this one thing that's error undefined. Another reference error that start recording is not defined. And so that in itself is also interesting. We can click record, and it does things. You can see start recording is called, and then there's this other issue. But we probably should work through this one first, just because when we load, that's automatically there, so that's probably a pretty bad sign. So now's the time to dive into how the original poster kind of created this document. So just looking at the hype elements itself, if we look at the action inspector, we can see when you hit record, the first thing it does is start recording. Stop is stop recording. So those are kind of the main interaction points. I see this init here. I'm assuming the init is, yeah, unseen load. It's going to call init. So that all makes a lot of sense. So why don't we look at init, because when we got that error happened before anything, so that's probably going to be emitted from init. And so here we see some declaration of variables, and then adding the event listener. And this is pretty much copied and pasted from the beginning right here. So this is not so sensical, because when we're in the app.js, all this code out here, not in a function, is in the global scope. And so these will be global variables. I assume like gumstream and things like that are going to be used later. Like here we're referencing gumstream. When we call init, this isn't the global scope. This is the function init. So this gumstream variable, the recorder variable, input, these things that look like they're supposed to be global variables, first of all, they're not global variables. And we can see the error was about start recording. We can see that's on this line here, that there's this record button. You're trying to add an event listener to click to start recording. So a few things stand out right here. First of all, start recording hasn't actually been defined anywhere. You have a hype function called start recording, but again, you need to figure out that there's scoping, and hype doesn't define its functions globally. So you can't reference a hype function like start recording just like in a global sense. That doesn't work. You would need to use the hype API. So if you wanted to get at this start recording function, what you would do is you would say hype document.functions, and then you would say .start recording. And so that's how you actually access this particular function. But the other thing that's interesting about this is I'm not sure this line is really even that necessary. You're adding an event listener to click to the record button, yet at the same time this is the record button, and within hype you have it use start recording. So personally, I don't think these two lines are necessary at all. So we can just get rid of those. And now these variables aren't really, we can have these, but naturally, like I said, there's this scoping issue where these are meant to be like global variables. But right now they're defined within the scope of init, so nothing else can access them. So we want to make these global variables. And so the way you can do that is you can add this to the head HTML of the document. So in the document inspector, I can say edit head HTML. I can define a script up here. And so I can add it there. Alternatively, I could do things like, if I said, window.gumstream, I could access variables that way. But this just makes it a little bit easier. This will automatically add it to the window object and make it global, so anything else just referencing just gumstream can have access. So now I have those. Those are kind of our globals that we may need later. And so that's included in the head. So now I think init, we don't really need init anymore because we're doing a lot of the initialization. Whoops, actually, that should not be in there, sorry. Should be, these still need to be in init because we have access to the Hive document. So now we do need init, sorry. And so now we can preview again and see what that did by making some of our variables global. So I'll go back to the console. And so now we have no errors, that's great. So now we know record will still call that start recording function, so let's see what happens. So we do record, and we get a call, start recording called. This looks like this is one of the logs in here, so that's great. But we do get another error, uncaught reference error again, __ log is not defined. And so we can look and see like, oh, that there's this log function being called. If you wanted to log to the console, you'd say console.log. This must be some kind of custom logging, so I'll copy here. I'm going to do a find in this document. I can see it's called a lot. Oh, and I can see at the bottom here there's this helper function which is being defined. And so this is just saying for the object log, add some inner HTML. So yeah, I probably need this somewhere. So I can look and stop recording. That also has this log. So I probably want this to be like in the global scope since a bunch of different functions are accessing it. So I'll just cut, whoops, I'll copy it. And again, I'm going to add it to the script part of my head HTML. So now this is going to be a global function. So let's preview again and let's see how far we get. So we'll go into the console, hit record, and that does not sound good. But we did get further. So I'm going to mute for a second. And so we have this other cannot read property undefined of undefined, and that doesn't really help too much. So we get some function calls. So it looks like we might want to look in here and see what that is. I don't think that was actually what we wanted. So let's go back to the console. Let's look in here. And so we're getting undefined of undefined, and so it looks like it has something to do with this. We can see we have like an error right here. So yeah, it looks like there's something going on with this encoding type select. And so that's kind of interesting because I did notice in the init we are getting this encoding type select. So that should exist, I would think, as far as an actual item. But this doesn't work. And so the interesting thing about JavaScript is that you're saying get element by ID. IDs are actually automatically added to the global scope. That's a little secret. I don't recommend relying on it. But so we can actually look and see what's going on here. So if I go into the console, I can type in encoding type select, and I can see like this is an actual object. But in the code that was failing, it's like encoding type select dot selected index. And a select box, which I assume is this guy, as it's defined, we'll see, has select, and it should have a selected index, one that is selected by default. So why doesn't it have it? What's going on? And so let's go into the console, and we'll try that. And yeah, that's undefined. And you have to think, like, that doesn't make too much sense, but I'm looking at this, and I can see that the object it printed out is not a select object. It's actually something bigger and contains a div and a select. And so that leads me to think that the encoding type select isn't actually pointing to the select box, which would have a selected index that's pointing to something else. So let's look at how this is defined. So I have this element here, and the ID should be pointing to
the select box. So I'm going to edit the inner HTML, and I can see, like, yeah, this select has the ID, encoding type select, that's all fine. But, you know what, thinking back about, like, the clicking, how there was two definitions of the clicking, maybe the original poster, added a unique element ID. So this is the case where there's two unique element IDs. One is for, like, the hype element, and then the other is for the select. And in this case, how this is set up, we actually want it to be on the select box because that's what we're referencing. We could go in deeper, we could set this up differently, but the easiest path to getting this work is just to remove the unique element ID here because there's already the unique element ID there. And that's the thing about IDs, you really should only have one. If you have two, you're going to run into problems. This is one of those problems. So let me close a bunch of these tabs. And let's try doing this again and see if we get further. So let's open up the console, hit record. So we did get a little further. Now we don't have that log. But we have this issue of the web audio recorder wave.min.js isn't being found. And okay, like we removed those files earlier, but now it seems we need those files. So how are we going to add these files back? And one of the interesting things is it looks like it's referencing this JS folder. Hype doesn't put things in JS folders like this. Hype puts things in a Hype resources folder that has this. So automatically I'm thinking like, oh, we're going to be up against a little bit of a wall because probably the web audio recorder is expecting things in a JavaScript folder because this file isn't in a JavaScript folder, so it's not kind of looking at itself and trying to find out who its siblings are. It has JS probably hard-coded somewhere. So that's going to be a little bit tough. So we might have to go in and change the paths and references in this web audio recorder and get it to not do JS. But I realized there's actually a really easy way around this problem, and that's Hype can in fact put things in JS folders. In Hype Pro, there's a feature called export scripts. So I'll go to that URL. Hype export scripts. And these can extend Hype and change the output. And there's one called Organized Assets, and this says exports with assets in a folder structure similar to Adobe Edge Animate, where it puts things in images, media, and hey, a JS folder. So that's really convenient in this case. This won't work in every case, but I can download this package, I can install it, and then I can get Hype exporting in a manner that's going to be consistent with what this plugin wants, or at least so I hope. We haven't seen that. So now, export scripts do a few things. It adds something to the export as HTML5, organized assets. So when you export this, now you'll need to export that way, not use in folder. Export via organized assets. It also means in preview, I can say preview using this export script, organized assets. So now I'll do that, and it's going to put all the JavaScript in a folder called JS, and we'll see, cross our fingers, that this works. So I'll go ahead and preview this, open up the console, and I'm going to hit record. And hey, we get no errors. We're probably recording something. That's a good sign. Let's hit stop. And stop got called. No errors with the start, so that's a good sign. But now again, we have this uncaught reference error, create download link is not defined. So we can see on complete, it's trying to do create download link. And yeah, it's having an issue finding that. So we can see, oh, in here there is create download link, but I bet this has the same problem as before where you think you can reference this because it's like for the global scope, but Hype doesn't put its functions in the global scope because it doesn't want to pollute the global namespace, so you can't really access things in that nature. So if we look at start recording, can probably find out where it's called. Yeah, it's called right there. So I could probably call this directly, but there's one thing to look, is that it's calling with its own arguments of blob and recorder.encoding. And Hype functions take in a Hype document element and an event. There are some hacks where you can kind of chain things on, or you could access these differently because you're calling it directly. But that's not really what you want to do in this case. So it's probably easier to take a look at the original source code, see, oh, there's this create download link. it doesn't seem to be referenced by anything else. So I could just copy this function and just kind of stick it at the bottom of the start recording, and then that'll actually define it within the scope, and that'll work. So now we don't need this create download link anymore. So if we want, we could actually just remove that. And so now we can try again and see if this is going to work.
So again, open up the console, hit record, I'm going to hit stop, and we solved that problem, but now we have this recordings list.append child is not a function. And that's kind of weird, but recordings list, I bet this is related here, and I can take a look inside and I can be like, oh, this is like the same thing where we have this unordered list of recordings list, but also the hype element itself has one, so I can say, oh, that probably just shouldn't exist because we're referencing the ID in here, not the top level. You can do it either way. You could actually say, give this the unique ID, and then you could add things on, but this is a regular div. It's not an unordered list. So at some point you might need to get at this element and then do your own searching within, so it's probably just easier to keep these IDs as they are. It's maybe a little bit less like hypey way to do things, but it's fine. And while we're at this, we might as well look at some other things like log, and we can see, oh, there's log that has unique ID. This also does, so while we're at it, why don't we just remove this, because that's probably going to get called too. Stop button, I don't know if these were actually referenced. I think we might want those. They were in it. I don't think they're actually used. We do know encoding type select was one of them. But yeah, there's no like inner HTML here. So I think those are safe. And so now we can try again. So let's preview this. Open up the console. Let's hit record. And we actually see some logging. That's great. Let's hit stop. And ooh, we have something. So I'll turn the volume on. And let's see if this plays back.
Let's hit record. And we actually see some logging. That's great. Let's hit.
And yeah, it looks like that works. So I think this is in at least a working state. So now we've kind of modified everything so the code works. And so that's the basic debug flow for figuring out what's going wrong. You have to look at the console. Really, I recommend working through each issue as you see it in order. Otherwise, you'll probably be doing things in the wrong method. And the key takeaway here is like paying attention to scoping. So if you have a original JavaScript, you need to see, is this in the global scope? Is this not in the global scope? When there's HTML functionality, you need to figure out how you are actually going to override it and bring it into height, and then make sure that you're not kind of doing duplicating effort or doing the wrong things, because that will also lead to errors, and kind of managing IDs and making sure you have IDs on the right elements as they're actually expected. So that's got this in a working state. I would say this is not the most hypey way of doing things at this point, but at least it works. So hopefully this kind of taught and will help you out. I will post this working version on the forums also, so you can at least have this working version. And I think probably depending on what you're doing, there may be a long way yet to go. I definitely recommend kind of learning more about JavaScript and scoping and some of the fundamentals there. I think that'll go a long way to helping out. And so that is that. Thanks.